All right, my guest today, I am super excited to have on the show. He wrote one of my top 3 books, maybe my favorite book of all time, also one of my most recommended books. It's called Satan in Autobiography, and we're going to get into more details on that today. He is a spiritual teacher and leader. He wrote the book, The Power of the Kabbalah, which I'm in the middle of right now, and it's just like the first book. It's brilliant. So I want to welcome to the show, Yehuda Berg. How are you today?
Very good. Thank you so much.
I'm so happy that you're here. I think we're going to add a ton of value to anybody who listens to this. And this book was a total game changer for me. It just put things into perspective. It took down kind of the blinds or the curtains that were over my eyes from years of religious programming. So tell us your background and how you got into teaching about spirituality and the Kabbalah and all of these ideas.
Okay. Well, I grew up in a house where my parents have their own sort of journey. You know, they had me and my brother as second marriage. So they were a bit older, but you know, they were already into a spiritual path. They were down a Kabbalistic path of Kabbalah, even before they had me. So my father met his spiritual teacher in 1962. I'm born in 1972, so he was already immersed fully in Kabbalah by the time I came around as a child. So I grew up in that, and then naturally progressed into that. And at 21 years old, I started writing. And the book you're reading now, I did when I was 21, and it progressed. And so that's my immersion into it. And so, you know, we had a very different kind of childhood, and this stuff is a result of that.
Yeah, it's amazing. And you write so simply and so eloquently. And before we get into Satan, why don't you explain kind of a simple overview of what the Kabbalah is and why it's as relevant now as ever?
Okay. Full disclosure, I'm not currently affiliated with the Kabbalah Center. And we'll get into the book because it's fascinating how, and this is me and, you know, other spiritual kind of people I've heard similar, where when you start going into the subject, it sort of has an effect on you, but we'll get there. Kabbalah has been around forever. You know, it's thousands of years old. It's a wisdom more than anything. You know, you don't need a basis of religion, but if you are a religious person, it's also cool. It's just a body of wisdom that a person could choose as they wish. Its sole purpose was to literally improve people's lives. And you can immerse with it fully and be a 24/7, 365 student, or grab a book, grab a piece of wisdom, and move on with your life, and your life was a little enriched.
Very good. Yeah. And it's, you know, there's definitely some principles of different religions tied into it. And even, you know, in your book, you talk about how physics is starting to reveal a lot of the things that the Kabbalah has talked about. So it's pretty fascinating. So let's dive into Satan and Autobiography. And first of all, I want to ask you, because the way this book is written, it's so good. Was this, I'm sure it was, but like divinely inspired? Do you consider this like channeled through you in a way, just because of how simple it is?
You know, when I think about it today, I would tell you it probably was, because not only did I at the time try to, in my mind, feel what our opponent, or whatever you want to call that, whatever's on the other side, right? So if you are a religious person, in the Bible, you go back to Adam and Eve. There's Adam, Eve, and the snake Satan, right? If you're not a religious kind of thing, you know, why are kids wanting sugar and not broccoli, right? There's a force there. There's some kind of force, right? You don't go become addicted to broccoli, you become addicted to sugar. And when I think about it now, and, you know, we've gone back and forth. I think you asked me to do this interview, and I resisted because this is not my full-time thing anymore. But in truth, since the book, I actually feel like I've met Satan myself. I've had, issues with drugs and alcohol. This is after the book, which is fascinating. So
Yeah.
I myself knew the system and knew there's an opponent, but he was at the time too strong for me.
I
And I feel like, I feel like I'm and no one should ever feel like they've overcome, because once an addict, always an addict. But I feel like I'm starting to see a little more of the power that this opponent is.
Well, for one, really appreciate the disclosure, because I go through that all the time, and I'm on the path, and I'm in personal development, and I'm meditating, and I'm trying to do the things, and it's still like I binge eat, or I watch a TV show way too long, or I do something that then I judge and criticize myself for, which we'll get into later. But it's an ongoing battle. So I guess that segues perfectly into, when I was a kid, I remember we had this Bible, and it had some pictures and illustrations of angels and different things throughout it. And in in one of the books, there was a picture of a red horned devil. And I remember that was like the image of Satan in my mind. And of course, that's kind of just a metaphor. Now I know that. But who or what is this Satan character?
So the way I grew up, again, this is the kind of Kabbalah / spiritual view of that. We were put in this world, and we were given, each and every one of us were given gifts. We're all gifted in some way or another, and sometimes it's harder, sometimes it's easier to find those gifts. And in order to really truly earn and manifest them, the way the world was set up is we have to overcome challenges. Imagine if Tiger Woods gave you a club that you'll always hole in one, eventually you'll stop golf, because you know the result.
Right.
But or any kind of move like that, where sort of we would shortcut. At the end of the day, we have our challenges. We're meant to fail. We're meant to fall. The opponent, or Satan, or the pitchfork guy in the metaphor in your Bible, is that force that's here in truth, not to make us fall, but to make us earn everything that we get.
Yeah. So you, in the Power of the Kabbalah, you talk about the baseball story, right? And tell that real quick, the little parable of the kid that throws the perfect game.
There's two baseball metaphors. There's one where they don't know the rules. That's one. Or
the one where the dad helps out.
Okay. So, I mean, again, there's, I'm a huge sports guy. I do my own martial arts training. I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And so a lot of times I speak in sports metaphors: golf, basketball, baseball. So in a scenario where, either a dad fixes a game for his kid, or there's some kind of manipulation to get a child or an adult, right? If steroids or cheating or any kind of way where you bypass kind of the way the world usually works. Now, kid doesn't know, everything is great. Kid finds out, suddenly all that ecstasy, he pitches a perfect game, or a grand slam to win the game in the bottom of the ninth, down 3, whatever that scenario is. If it's found out, if the kid finds out that the dad fixed that, almost all that enjoyment, all that entire bubble just bursts, and the joy, the happiness, and all that, because we want to feel that we've gotten. If we climb Everest, we've climbed Everest. A guy who lands in a helicopter on top of Mount Everest, is he on top of Mount? He could take a nice picture and post it on Instagram, but he hasn't done anything.
Yeah. So the real joy in life and our existence and why we're here is to learn how to earn. And you talk about in the beginning, we were just connected to divine receiving, right? And we just we received from God or source everything we needed, and there was no achievement because we didn't lack anything. And so talk about the role of Satan to kind of provide the distance between that, or the barrier, so that we could then earn our way back to that.
So we come into this world in the metaphor, or, Kabbalah has a metaphor of us coming into the world. And if there's a force out there, if you're religious, you call it God. If you're a specific religion, you'll call it whatever your connection is, Allah, or however you want to call and make that connection. But if you're a religious person, there's a God. God creates this world, creates humans, and humans are given everything in its original kind of context. And as an ultimate receiver, even if you go back to Adam and Eve, right? Adam and Eve and Satan, Adam and Eve are given everything. Everything is in that Garden of Eden. And you would almost want to say that Adam and Eve had to get kicked out of the Garden of Eden in order to earn their way back into the Garden of Eden. And the force that helps you overcome and get back is that snake that appears in the. So we take that metaphor. Again, if you're not a Bible believer, which I personally am, I grew up with it, there's something super true that resonates inside me. But even if you're not a Bible believer, and you're just someone on a spiritual path, you could take that as a metaphor. It doesn't have to be, that every single thing is a literal story. The metaphor still stands, right? We come here in order to return back to happiness, return back to joy, return back to happiness. And too much happens along the way that blocks us. But remember, that's part of the journey. Part of the journey is a blockage is created, or Satan creates that blockage, and we're meant to overcome that. Or we're just meant to learn, you know what? Don't do that. This is a do not enter. Maybe try something else.
Mm-hmm. So you talk a lot about kind of the illusion of separation, right? We're still all connected with that God, with that source, with that consciousness or energy. But the ego is like the veil. It's not some being outside of us, right? That's just a metaphor, but it's a veil within us that makes us think that we're separated. Did I explain that right?
Yes. You could do this, Kabbalah thing, by the way.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, you like get it. Like you could actually disseminate the information.
Well, that's what we're trying to do here, right? But I've read the book, 4 or 5 times. It's I guess maybe not as impressive with how much I've studied it, but I absolutely love it. And so, when I was a kid, it was like Satan was outside of us, and then I started, as I grew and studied, that the Bible's full of metaphors and Jesus spoke in parables. And so when you look at it,
yes, exactly,
metaphorically, and go ahead.
100%. And there's what's beautiful when you're on a spiritual path is that you grow up and this magical satanic force is external, and then you start learning that it's actually inside us. But the beauty is that force inside is not to cause us to hate ourselves, to feel shame, to feel guilt, to feel all that. It's supposed to create actually compassion to the self. Dude, this world was created for us not to be perfect. So when we live our imperfections, we're actually living the path that Source wants us to live. We're meant to fail. And the question is not, are we going to fail? The question is, are we going to kill ourselves for failing? Are we going to put ourselves even lower for failing? Are we going to use this and really live that self-compassion? Or are we gonna guilt ourselves? And I'm born Jewish. If you're Christian, we all, Catholic guilt, Jewish guilt. I think everywhere there's guilt. Yes. And guilt isn't good for anyone. Guilt is Satan's way of saying, I'm not going to just beat you once because you didn't listen to didn't listen to God. but I'm going to get you again. And his second beating, which is through guilt and shame, is the worst. And I can tell you myself, being in recovery, that the biggest obstacle for recovering addicts is living with the guilt and shame.
And I think the Buddha calls that, what's that, second arrow? There's
Yeah.
some metaphor like that.
Yes.
And we can get into that in a minute, but yes, the judgment there. So, but I remember reading this book and it was so freeing, because it was like, the ego is, the Satan is adversary, right? And so the ego is like, it's like a training partner to push you to be your best. It's not some like satanic force that wants you to lose. It's something that you got to keep overcoming and keep growing through. And I remember somebody gave me the book Ego is the Enemy after I had read this, and I was like, I don't even want to read that book, because in my story, it's more like kind of an opponent to play and go back and forth with, and when we lose to it, it's overcoming that judgment, right?
Yes, and and sometimes I feel like even people in the spiritual realm, we get too locked into, I have to defeat this ego.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of us. If it's part of us and we're literally, figuratively part of source, right? Anyone who's a living being, whether animals or plants or even humans, we're all part of source. Because if not, we wouldn't be alive, right? Source is in us. And if ego's part of us, then there's a part of source in that too. And so many of us focus on, in sort of the spiritual self-help, on achieving what we don't have. And it almost sometimes brings us down. Instead of saying, no, I'm appreciating everything I have, but you know what? I want to get to a place where I could get even more.
Mm-hmm.
But not to lowering of the self. Not to say, oh, I gave into my ego, I'm a bad human. No, whatever choices we've made in our entire life, those choices don't determine who we are. Those choices don't define you. Those are just choices you made.
Yes. And often our best learning opportunities, right? And I remember I did a meditation a while ago, and the ego appeared to me as like a woman who wanted to be danced with instead of like an opponent to fight with, And so it was like to redirect the energy of it, and to understand it's an ongoing symphony of, kind of push and pull. And that metaphor always stuck with me. So I guess talk about some of the teachers historically in the past, right? Because I believe, there's a game of telephone where you say something to someone, and then by the time it gets down the line, the message is totally different. So when we think back to our spiritual teachers, what was their message surrounding Satan and the ego?
So you could go as far back as far back as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And they again, if you're unfamiliar in any of the biblical story, there's so much in the biblical stories. Joseph and his brothers, right? How in the world do people who are, let's say, let's assume, right? No one was there, but let's assume Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are great souls, right? Great teachers. How is it that their grandchildren sell their brother? What could have possibly gone through their mind? Or as you go on in the Bible, right? What in the world those, and then fast forward to Jesus' time, right?
Mm-hmm.
The guys selling the sacrifices in the temple, the people, the corruption that was happening that he was talking about. How could you, like, if I'm, again, I'll go back to basketball. If I'm in the presence of Michael Jordan, right? You feel a certain kind of, well, I actually I was in Miami in a restaurant once, and the table behind me was Michael Jordan. And I had my Michael, because I grew up a Knicks fan, and he killed us every time. and I'm like, wow, so I went over and said hi. But you feel something. You're like in presence of greatness.
Yes.
And then there's people that we've met throughout our life, or we've seen on TV, or we've been inspired by. Imagine you sat next to them. You'd be like, oh my God, they'll be in awe. And how do these guys in the temple not feel the awe? I mean, the temple in Jerusalem at the time, emanated light. We've all, I don't want to generalize, most of us have been in some kind of place, whether that place was a church or that place was, on your phone, listening to a podcast, getting inspired, feeling a sense of joy, feeling a sense of elevation, having aha moments. How do you then go and sell stuff in the temple? How do you sell your brother? Like, things don't make sense. But when we look at our life, I know you asked about teachers, but at the end of the day, no matter how far back you go, there are lessons, and right in our own life, at the end, we're our greatest teachers.
Yes.
And our environment, when I say the environment, parents, and if a person, didn't exactly have the best parent, or single parent, or no parent, whatever that environment is, those are our biggest teachers. I have 5 kids. They're huge teachers. They bring out in me. And if siblings are teachers, parents, siblings, family, friends, all of that entire environment, they're there to teach, and they definitely push our buttons, and they definitely inspire us to be better, because our opponent uses all that. The closer person is to us, the easier it is for Satan to manipulate the situation, to make us react, to make us get angry, to make us get jealous, etc.
Yeah, and so you talk about tests, right? There's many chapters in this book on the different kind of tests with money and relationships. And I know I think, when I talk about hypnosis, and we're programmed to have an automatic response, right? The limbic system, and we all have these different programs that are the triggers that we have to overcome, right? Each of us has a different task in our life. Some people it's anger, some people it's addiction, some people it's self-doubt or judgment. And so those people that are close to us, they give us those triggers. And one of the first steps is to watch those responses, those emotional responses, and then to say, oh, that's the Satan, that's the ego. And
Yes.
then from there, you're empowered, right?
Yeah. But just, I said it twice, but even when you listen to the ego, even when you listen to the opponent, even when you listen to Satan, and whatever happens, it just it's okay. It's not the end of the world. We're not meant to be perfect.
So I teach that, when we become in rapport with others, we become kind of one energy in a sense. And so when we start to lose the ego, we get that rapport, and we start to feel more oneness with everything. And then when we judge, right, the judgment is from the ego. When we judge ourselves for losing, that's when you get that second dart, I think it's what it's called. And what you referred to as, being the worst thing for addicts is the judgment of self, because then you lose rapport with yourself, right?
I mean, you lose that connection.
Yeah.
To self, and then if we've lost connection to self, if our body gets disconnected from that, call it soul, and then that soul gets disconnected from source, it just promotes this connection. If we could just stop the judgment of others, judgment of ourselves, again, not perfect, but if we could go 5 for 10, and yesterday we went 4 for 10, and there's progress, and we feel better about ourselves, and the more you connect yourself, the easier it is to then not judge other people. But if we feel bad about ourselves and we judge ourselves harshly, we're bound to judge others even harsher.
So that ties in perfect to the next question I was going to ask, which was about karma, or in your book, you call it measure for measure. And so talk about some of the principles of that measure for measure.
It starts with Newton's third law, right? Each action has an equal and opposite reaction, and um, and sometimes when you look at the world, it doesn't seem right. You know, people who do horrendous things, people are dictators and do all kinds of things, stay in power for years, and then so many, each and every one of us knows at least one or two or few people who are the most gentlest, people with the biggest heart, big people with, and certain things don't go the way they should, what we think they should. So it's sort of, you know, on one hand, I truly believe that every action has a reaction, and whatever you put out there eventually comes back. The problem is that source world of the law of cause and effect and our world don't exactly match up.
Yes.
Certain people who, all of us, 100% of the population, not talking, you know, whatever your political views are, or whatever these views are, or whatever that clouds the way we judge. But there are certain people who nobody would argue. And it looks like they're not paying for their negativity. And certain people looks like they're not getting paid for their positivity. Unfortunately, we don't live in the source world. If we had glasses that could sort of taint the world into source world, everything would make sense. But instinctually, deep inside, I believe that whatever energy you put out, that comes back. And there are our opponent, Satan, you know, time is on his side. So he delays sometimes the return on the cause. So it's not immediate. So things get skewed. If you looked at life over 80 years, 90 years, you'd be able to piece the pieces a lot easier together. But we look at the immediate cause and effect.
Yes.
We look at the immediate everything, and sometimes it's hard to see the cause and effect. But if we know that you'll drop an egg on the floor and it's going to break, because the law of cause and effect, if you throw the ball against the wall, it comes back comes back at you. So too in the spiritual world, just sometimes the spiritual world doesn't exactly operate under our terms and conditions.
Right. And you talk a lot about patience. And I think, you know, a lot of people might call that faith, is just knowing that the good that you do will come back in equal measure at some point. Right. And it might not be on your terms, and it probably won't be. And that's probably what makes this life so exciting, because it'd probably be boring if it, you know, like if you put a coin in a slot machine and you pulled it and you got paid every time, you'd be bored with it. And so it's that spontaneous return of that energy, possibly, right?
Yes.
So in the book, you say, God does not command, God does not punish, and the Lord of all creation most definitely does not reward. So that's a little controversial to what I grew up with. What do you mean by that?
So I don't believe that God sits up there. And when I say me, you know, I've had many teachers throughout my life, so it's not me. I'm just another peg in another domino in the line. But you know, God doesn't say, okay, I like him, he's going to have $1 billion. I don't like him, so he's going to suffer his whole life, just the minimum wage, just have enough money to be broke, and just this and just that. That's not you know, God doesn't play favorites. God, we're all equal, and we're all part of source in the name of, in the eyes of the Creator. But what does happen is our perception of God for us in our life, for us, as we act, that's how the universe acts with us. Because if God were to give somebody and not the other just because, then the whole universe has no purpose, no meaning, and it's just someone or some energies, just random kind of decisions. And we know it's not like that. We know that God is just, and God is one to all, and it's just our perfect. And this is something that I think we could take to heart. We're all, each and every one of us is put in the perfect situation to be able to achieve what it is that we came here to achieve.
Yes.
We all have fights we have to fight. We all have issues we have to overcome, and it's all perfect. And to one person, not being able to not have that drink is everything.
Mm-hmm.
And for another person, it's whatever challenges. We all have challenges, and in our own world, that is, I can't judge your challenges, and you can't judge mine, because we've all put into the perfect situation to be able to achieve what we came here to achieve.
Yes. And so in the book, you have a chapter titled Becoming God. And this has kind of been an idea I've been kicking around a lot more lately. You know, I always thought we were created in the image of God with some divine powers. You know, we could speak and think things into existence. We could create life. But I got, more into thinking about being God, right? And not in a egotistical way, but in like a very humble, we're imbued with these powers of creation. So talk about, I guess, becoming God and what that means to you and what that means in the Kabbalah.
So the metaphor we use to humanity and the Creator is that we're all figuratively part of the divine.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's a mountain, and then if you took Everest as being God in a metaphor, and all that is God, and then each and every one of us, all 7 people of the world, were one peg or one stone of Everest. And we all had that. So we were all given a part of Source, and we're all are part of Source. So I believe that we all come from there, and Source is embedded inside us, and we just have to open ourselves up and see it.
So what are some easy ways that you teach to be able to see that more, to be able to connect more with the feeling, the gratitude, because we've all been in those states where we just feel tapped in and connected. What are some ways that you teach to get to access that energy more?
First thing, you need to search for quiet.
Mm-hmm.
Some people meditate, like you mentioned earlier. You're a big meditator, and hypnosis and all that. That's many ways of just getting to quiet. There's so much noise around us, between the news, between this, what we're actually experiencing today in today's world, this crazy year of 2020,
yeah.
Which feels like it's 3 years and we're not even halfway done.
It does.
But find the time for quiet. With all the noise, it's really hard to tap into Source. The first step is quiet. Without quiet, it's really hard. I'm not saying you can't, but it's really hard to get to anywhere without first having quiet. Once you get to quiet, there's a metaphor in the Power of Kabbalah book that, the Source kind of, if you wanted to have a metaphor to the radio station of Source, very quiet. The frequency operates on a very quiet frequency, and the opponent, Satan's frequency, is very loud.
Yes.
And unfortunately, during the day, if we don't have awareness, which is step 2, quiet and then awareness, you'll listen to the louder one always because it's louder. But if you have an awareness, this is that, this is Satan, this is Source, then we could go and then put our energy into the source. But if we don't have an awareness that there's source and there's ego and there's Satan and all this stuff, we just listen to the louder voice.
It's a perfect metaphor, because I teach what I call my antenna theory of emotions, and that our brain and our body is an antenna that taps into different frequencies, right? And so when the ego takes over the frequency, we have a lot of doubt, we have a lot of fear, and then going into meditation allows you to quiet and put your antenna in a frequency which is more connected with source. So I love the metaphor. And then we can start wrapping up here, but I know one of the principles that's talked about a lot, and we come at it from a few different angles in the book. It's the idea of love thy neighbor as yourself, right? And it's also kind of connected to, you talk about the 4 levels of desire, with the highest level of desire is to do things for others. So can you talk about what it means in regards to the ego to come with a servant's heart, to be selfless in your pursuit of spirituality?
So we're all put in here, and each one of us has our own, call it movie of life, right? Our own life. There are players, and if you take the movie analogy, actors who are put in our close proximity that are there to actually help us to get to our highest self. If someone next to me is going through pain and I could help them, their pain in my movie is only there so I could help their pain. If someone is in need of any kind of help, the reason they're in my movie, right? They're not in Brazil. They're not in Uzbekistan. They're right in front of me. The reason they're in front of me, and when the Bible says love thy neighbor as thyself, what the Bible is saying, it's part of you. It's part of yourself. The reason why the people around us are going through what they're going through, and we have to ask ourselves, what can I do? Sometimes you're meant to do nothing because they're meant to go through it by themselves. But it needs to be an awareness and an active choice. Okay, this person I'm going to help like this. This person I'm going to help like that. This person, all I'll let them know is I'm here for them, but that they actually have to go through their process themselves.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of, I think they did an experiment out with 3 students that were interviewing for seminary school, or a job as a preacher or whatever. And they put a man out on the sidewalk, just like the Good Samaritan, right? And most of the preachers going into interview just walked right over him, right? They didn't stop and help the person that needed help that was right in front of them. And I know I probably do that all the time when I'm thinking, I'm ambitious and I have goals and I got this to work on, and there's somebody that's right in front of me that my ego has just kind of blinded me to, and I just kind of walk around it. And I feel like we do that a lot in our lives, don't we?
We do, unfortunately.
Yeah. So this is a good awareness, and I love that, they're in my movie so I can help them. Like, that's the whole purpose of that. And I love that. And that's definitely going to give me some awareness and presence to those around me in pain. Beautiful. Let's see. Anything else you want to share from the book, or any of the other books that we haven't covered?
Just, it's not really from that. It's just each person on their own journey. No one faith or no one system or whatever it is that you're learning can claim to have all the answers. If you find answers, great. If not, make an effort and find answers. This world has so much to offer, and guilt, shame are not one of the gifts in this world. Guilt and shame are here to be overcome. Self-doubt, self-questioning, not being able to forgive thyself. All this are things that are meant to overcome. Took me personally years to get to a place where I'm feeling good with myself. And I just wish everyone to, have more compassion to the self and realize how amazing we are.
That's beautiful. So as you were talking, I realized a couple things, but I'll leave a few what I call open loops for our listeners. So you have a great chapter on money. You have a great chapter on soulmates, and I'm gonna leave it at that. So people definitely have to go get the book now to get your insights on that. And then the last thing is religion. So you opened my eyes to see that there's truth in every religion, right? Before it was like my God's the only God, but now as I've studied, many different aspects of religion, I see, this kind of overlaps and this is different, but I like that. And here's some truth there. And it's those of us that can kind of get past that ego, can see the truth in any religion.
Interesting. As you were talking, I had dinner with a friend. He's comes from Houston, and he said, I grew up in this small little church. It's literally called the Church of Jesus Christ. That's the name of the church. 300 people in the whole church. They sort of have it's its own little religion inside the religion, right? Its own little. And the preacher, and my friend would tell me, the preacher would get up every single Sunday and say, if you're not part of this church, Jesus won't redeem you. Jesus won't. And he's like, eventually, when he was like 16, he's like, he's there to tell me that at the time, 6 billion people, 300 are going to heaven and everybody else is going to hell? This doesn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. So I believe that each person, it's not by coincidence that you're born a Catholic or this, whatever you are born with, it's not by coincidence. Now, if you go full forward, and you feel something is missing, then make a choice. But we need to honor and respect any religion.
Yes.
And appreciate any lessons we've gotten from anywhere in life. And religion has, unfortunately, could be the thing that brings us together or separates us. And the intention was have everyone be a believer in something, mm-hmm. and then we can unite.
I love that. All right, so last question, I promise. Any last parting words of advice to someone right now that's going through this tumultuous year of 2020 on how to bring us together and find peace in their hearts?
I go through many kind of issues myself with this, with what's going on around us. But mm-hmm. We have to just know, that things have to be A, there for a reason, and B, there to somehow, we won't know this now, and maybe not anytime soon, but somehow all of this is going to make us better.
Yes. Better
people, better everything.
Absolutely. Beautiful. Well, I would, again, go buy this book. It's not a recommendation. It's a requirement. I've read it 4, 5, 6 times, and I continue to revisit it because I continue to get nuggets from it. So Yehuda, I am more than honored and grateful that you joined us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And dropping all of your wisdom, and I'm sure we will apply this in our lives. So thanks again.
Thank you so much.
And where can people find you?
Right now, at Yehuda Berg on Instagram and at Yehuda Berg on Twitter and Facebook, same.
Okay.
So that's, I communicate daily with people, and, people could just connect with me.
Yeah. You have a great Instagram feed, so I follow you there. So, all right. Well, I appreciate your time.
Okay. Thank you.